Greetings, Year 9s. This is Miss Fox, and welcome to a refresher on your critical evaluation. This was done in class last week and was set for homework, but I understand that some people might be revising their work, so I decided to put a YouTube video together to remind you of what we covered. Guys, you need to do critical evaluations for just simply two sources. One of your primary sources and one of your secondary sources, the ones that you pick are up to you. Then you have been given a table. It asks you to simply fill in the information. I'm happy for you to do this table in dot points, but correct language conventions apply. The first section of the table is comprehension. In that, you're meant to take notes on what your source says slash shows about the topic. Here you're being explicit. I want you to detail the obvious information the source states or shows. Summarize the key points. So take some notes. Then next you've got interpretation. What does the source imply slash mean to the topic? Guys, this is where you go with a bit more higher order thinking. So it's asking you to give the implicit information that you find. So information that you can infer from the source that may not be clearly stated or shown, but is still there. So what does the source suggest? Then you've got analysis. So here you're deconstructing the source. What do you know about it? So can you tell me if it's a primary or secondary source? How do you know? Who's the author, or where did you find it from? And what does that say about how reliable it is? What are their credentials? Was it a war photographer? Was it a soldier? Was it in a textbook? Guys, think about the time of creation. How close was it created to the event? For example, if it was created during the event, it's clearly a primary source and might provide really good insight into what it was like, but it might be created a long time after the event. It might be reflective or simply be giving information. Tell me what type of source it is. Is it written, visual, or is it an artifact? An artifact is usually an item. I expect for most of your sources to be written or visual. Next thing you need to think about is the purpose it was made. Why was the source made? Was it simply to give information about a topic? Was it to capture an experience, so show what things were like? Were they trying to do something? May they have a motive? For example, if you're doing propaganda, why did they make propaganda? Then you need to think about the intended audience of the source. Who are they making this source for, or who did they intend to see the source? So for example, textbooks, clearly that's dedicated to students. When you have information on websites, that might be dedicated to the Australian public. Even when you have photos, who would they want to see the photo? Was it to show information to other soldiers? Was it to send information back home? Was it simply to capture events? You might also think about a source like a map. Who would be reading the map? So what's the intended audience? Next, you look at point of view. Whose perspective was shown? So it might be an individual's perspective. So it could be a soldier writing in a diary. That's their perspective. But usually you'll see it's the perspective of a wider group. For propaganda, whose perspective is being shown? It may be the government's, but that might also be reflective of how the Australian public is thinking. Next, you need to consider, is there likely bias? Bias can usually be detected, as we've discussed, if it's emotional or if it's one-sided. So for example, usually propaganda has heavy bias. There might be slight bias when you see, for example, a heroic war picture because you're favouring maybe Australian fighters. So think about, does it have any bias to it? The last thing you simply need to think about is corroboration and contradiction with other sources. So when you look at your source and you've completed research, does the research that you've done confirm that the source is correct? Or does the source contain information that goes against the other information you found with your sources? Lastly, you're making a judgment. So this is the key evaluation point. Accuracy. How correct is the information and why? Reliability / credibility. Can you trust the information or the source, and why can you trust it? And then usefulness. Why is the source of use to your research? What does it show? Make bullet points. What is the value or limitations of the source based on your analysis? So why is it good is the value, but the limitations is, does it only show a small bit of information? Or is it one-sided? Or is it biased? Consider that, as in being biased, consider that. Guys, here is an example of a critical evaluation. So they've selected simply a photo from the trenches and they've provided a caption and explained the source and who made it. So comprehension, this is where they're giving me basic information. They're saying that the image shows soldiers in the trench and that the trench is clearly narrow. The soldiers are wearing different hats. In the trench, there are sandbags for additional protection. It's on a steep slope, which is in the left of the photo, and there looks to be a toilet in the foreground. So for their comprehension, it's mainly descriptive. They've told me explicitly what's in the image. Then we move on to interpretation. So they've thought about why this source is important, and they've noted that this source demonstrates how the conditions that the soldiers were exposed to in the trenches. They've noted that the hats being different may indicate different ranks, so it shows there's a variety of fighters there. Then you've got the fact that the terrain is very difficult to fight in. So they've noted that attacking uphill they're attacking uphill when the Turkish army is on high ground. They've also noticed that there's no privacy. They can deduce that from the fact that the toilet is next to where the men are standing. Then they've gone through their analysis. They've deduced that it's a primary source, and they noted who took the photo and when. They note who the photographer was. They think about the purpose. They believe that the reason it was created was to provide a record of fighting conditions during the Gallipoli campaign. For them, they believed that the intended audience, or those who were seeing it, were military personnel at the time, although this could be used for the public. That is a fair assumption to make. They felt that it was the Australian perspective, and the reason they believe that it's the Australian perspective is it only shows Australian soldiers in the trench, so it's not really looking at any other fighters. Then they said it appears to not be biased. They think that it's mainly just factual information, there's no real emotion, it's just showing a trench. And lastly, corroboration. They decided that this image, after looking at other images and information, they believe that it corroborates with other sources, and therefore the information is correct. Lastly, they've made a judgment. They've noted that it's an accurate representation of what it was like in the trenches. They believe it's reliable and credible because it's a primary source, and the photo, they can't see any reason why it would be changed or doctored, as in photoshopped. They believe it is a useful source because it shows physical conditions at the place, as in Gallipoli trenches, but the limitation is it only shows a small area, so it is really hard to tell exactly how trenches were like when they're only showing you a tiny section of it. So they note that although it's useful, it does have limitations. Guys, the last thing they said is it does not show a broader picture of the geography, who the soldiers are, or what's happening at the time. So even though it is a fine source, it really isn't that heavily detailed and doesn't give much more information. This is fine to have a source that you think's average, but you need to explain what its limitations are, why it is a little less valuable than it could be. And that is the end. You simply repeat this for one more source. So if this was a primary, you need to do it for a secondary. And then you're done. So overall, you fill in this table twice for one primary source and one secondary source, and you're done. Well done.